Lieutenant Sirath of the Voran Alliance had seen many strange things in her life. She had walked through the ruins of fallen worlds, watched suns collapse, and seen machines that thought they were alive. But that morning, when she entered the medical recovery chamber, she saw something she had never seen before: a sleeping human. The human was lying on the white bed, still and quiet, connected to thin silver wires that hummed softly. The machines around him beeped slowly, marking his pulse. His body was covered in bruises and burns, his uniform torn and blackened with smoke. His face was peaceful, but his hands were clenched tight, as if he was still fighting a battle in his dreams. Sarath walked closer, her claws clicking lightly on the floor. She had read about humans in the Alliance archives. They were said to be strange creatures, emotional, unpredictable, and dangerously brave. But this was the first time she had ever seen one with her own eyes. She expected fear or anger, but what she saw instead made her stop in silence. The human was whispering in his sleep. His lips moved slowly, the words broken and soft. Sarath tilted her head, adjusting her translator implant to catch the faint sounds. The human was speaking in his language, Old Earth tongue. Maria, Liam, hold on. I'll find you. The words pierced her like a blade. She didn't understand who Maria or Liam were, but the tone was unmistakable. It was grief. He was dreaming of people he had lost. Even in his sleep, the pain had not left him. Sarath looked at the tablet near his bed. The record said his name was Elias Carter, pilot of the Earth vessel Dauntless. His ship had been destroyed 3 days ago near the neutral zone. When the rescue team found him, the rest of his crew was gone. Only he had survived. Strange creature, she whispered. Why do you hold on? Her own kind, the Voran, believed in release. When someone died, they erased their memories of that person, removed the pain, the sorrow, the love. It was their way to keep the heart clean. But this human, he refused to let go. He carried the weight of the dead like a chain around his soul. Sarath stepped closer. In his right hand, he held a small piece of metal, pressed tightly against his chest. Curious, she leaned in and saw what it was: the insignia of his ship. A broken badge burned at the edges, but still showing the word Dauntless, even in sleep. Even half dead, he refused to let it go. Sarath didn't know why, but something about that small act filled her with unease and respect. Her people would have called it foolish. She called it something else: human. She turned to leave, but paused when his voice broke through again, low and trembling. Don't leave me. The words made her heart tighten. For a moment she wanted to answer, to tell him he wasn't alone, but she didn't. She was a soldier. Feelings were not her duty. Yet as she stood there, watching the fragile creature breathe in the dim blue light, something began to change inside her. When she looked at him, she didn't just see a survivor. She saw hope. There was a saying among her people: the stars belong to the ones who endure the dark. Maybe that's why humans had reached so far into the galaxy, because they never stopped enduring. She sat quietly in the corner of the chamber for a long time. The machines hummed, the humans slept, and the stars outside glowed faintly through the transparent wall. Sarath found herself wondering what kind of pain could make a being cling so hard to the memory of others. When her shift ended, she left the room slowly, but before exiting, she turned one last time to look at him. His face had softened and the corners of his lips curved slightly, not in pain this time, but in peace. And that's when she realized the truth. This human had lost everything, yet he still dreamed of saving others. He was broken, yet he still held on to hope. He was asleep, yet his spirit, his human spirit, was still awake. Sarath didn't believe in miracles. Not until that moment. Because when she walked into that room expecting to see a dying creature, what she saw instead was the most alive thing she had ever encountered. A heart that refused to give up, even when the universe itself tried to silence it. When Elias Carter opened his eyes, the first thing he felt was pain. Not sharp pain, but deep, slow, endless pain, spreading through every part of his body. His chest burned, his throat was dry, and his head felt heavy like a stone. The white lights above him were too bright. He blinked a few times before his vision cleared. He was lying on a strange bed surrounded by machines that hummed softly. The air smelled clean but foreign, like metal and medicine. He wasn't on the Dauntless. He remembered the explosion, the fire, the screams of his crew, Maria shouting his name, Liam's last words through the comms. Then, while nothing, a soft voice pulled him back. You are awake. Elias turned his head slowly. A tall alien stood beside him. Gray-blue skin, dark eyes that reflected light like glass, and an expression that was calm but unreadable. Her voice carried a slight echo, gentle yet firm. I am Lieutenant Sarath of the Voran Alliance, she said. You were found near the remains of your ship. You are safe now. Elias blinked, trying to understand her words. My crew? His voice cracked. Sarath's gaze lowered. We found no other survivors. The words hit him like a hammer. He closed his eyes, his breath uneven. His body shook, not from injury, but from the storm rising inside him. The guilt, the loss, the memory of the fire swallowing everything. Sarath took a small step closer. You should rest. The medical systems are still repairing your wounds, but Elias didn't rest. He stared at the ceiling, eyes open, his jaw tight. After a long silence, he whispered, I can't rest. Not yet. For the next few hours, Sarath observed him quietly. Most beings who had lost so much would break down or shut off emotionally. But humans, she was learning, were not like most beings. Instead of despair, he asked for his uniform. Instead of silence, he asked questions about his rescue, the coordinates, the debris, anything that could give him a hint about what happened. Was there any life signal near the wreck? He asked. Sarath shook her head. Only yours. Any escape pods? Destroyed. He took a deep breath, then said softly, Then I owe them everything. That sentence stayed in Sarath's mind for a long time. Owe them everything. It was such a human thing to say, to take loss and turn it into a promise. Later that night, Sarath watched him through the observation glass. The medical chamber was quiet except for the steady hum of the machines. Elias should have been resting, but he wasn't. He was training. Despite the pain, despite the broken ribs and bandaged arms, he forced himself to stand. The sensors beeped in protest. The robotic nurse tried to stop him, but he pushed it aside gently and began to move. Slow at first, then faster. Sarath entered the chamber. You will tear your muscles again, she warned. He didn't stop. Better than letting them die on me. His voice was calm, but his eyes were alive with fire. Not rage, not madness. Something deeper. Purpose. Sarath folded her arms. You humans. You always fight, even when there's nothing left to fight for. He paused and looked at her. There's always something to fight for. Like what? Memory, he said simply. And the people who believed in me. For a moment, Sarath didn't know what to reply. The Voran avoided pain, erased grief, and lived with calm hearts. But this human, this fragile, wounded creature, and I carried his pain like a weapon. He didn't run from it. He used it. When she left him that night, she found herself unsettled. Not afraid why, but changed. Something in her had shifted, something she couldn't name yet. The next morning, she returned to the chamber and found Elias standing by the window, staring out at the stars. His reflection looked thin, pale, but proud. I used to think space was silent, he said without turning. But when you've lost people out there, you start to hear them in the silence. Sarath looked at him, her chest tightening. Does that not hurt you? He smiled faintly. Of course it does. But that's how I know I'm still alive. For a long time, neither spoke. The stars outside shimmered like tiny memories scattered across the dark. Sarath finally understood what made humans different. They didn't just survive wounds. They grew from them. They didn't erase pain. They honored it. And as she watched the lonely human standing against the infinite black sky, she realized something else. Elias Carter was not just a survivor. He was a reminder that even in the cold, endless dark of the galaxy, the fire of humanity still burned, fragile, fierce, and eternal. Days turned into weeks, and Elias Carter began to heal. The doctor said his body was recovering faster than expected, but Sarath knew it wasn't only the medicine that kept him alive, for it was his will. He still walked with a limp, his left arm wrapped in medical cloth, yet every day he trained. He lifted, ran, and pushed himself until the machine screamed warnings. He didn't stop even when he bled. Most soldiers of the Voran Alliance admired him now. They whispered about the human pilot who refused to stay down. Some called him reckless. Others called him brave. Sarath wasn't sure what to call him, but she knew she couldn't stay away every evening. She found herself in the medical hall, watching him as he repaired small devices, wrote on scraps of paper, or simply stared at the stars. There was a quiet strength in the way he moved. a strength that came from pain, not power. One evening, she finally asked the question that had been building in her mind since the day he woke. "Human," she said softly, standing behind him. "Why do you fight so hard?" Elias looked up from the small metal insignia he always kept in his hand. He turned it slowly, the worn edges glinting under the white light. "I don't fight because I want to," he said. "I fight because I have to." Sarath tilted her head. "Have to? For what reason? Your people are far away. Your ship is gone. You owe nothing here." Elias smiled faintly, though his eyes carried a sadness too deep to hide. "That's where you're wrong. I owe them." He pressed the insignia to his chest. "The ones who didn't make it. Maria, Liam, my crew. They trusted me to bring them home. I failed them, so now I fight to make sure their memory doesn't die with me." Sarath was silent for a moment. The Vorin believed that pain was poison, something to be removed for the sake of peace. But this human carried his pain like a shield. "You speak as if memory gives you strength," she said. "It does," Elias replied. "When you lose everything, memory is what reminds you why you keep going." Sarath's eyes softened. "But it hurts you?" He nodded. "Yes, but if I stop remembering them, then I stop being human." His words stayed with her long after she left. That night, Sarath walked through the observation deck alone. The stars stretched endlessly before her, bright, cold, and quiet. Her people had long ago given up keeping the past. They erased memories of their dead, their wars, even their mistakes. They called it the path of serenity, but as she stared into the black sea of light, she began to wonder, maybe serenity wasn't strength. Maybe it was just forgetting, and maybe the humans, with their fragile bodies and stubborn hearts, were strong not because they ignored pain, but because they faced it every single day. The next morning, Sarath brought Elias a small data pad. On it was a map of the wreckage site of the Dauntless. "You asked about your crew," she said. "These are the last coordinates before the explosion." Elias looked up at her with surprise. "You didn't have to—" "I wanted to," she interrupted. "You said you fight to remember. Then I will help you remember." For the first time he smiled, a real warm smile. "Thank you, Sarath." That smile did something to her. It was simple but powerful, like the first ray of light breaking through a storm. She didn't know why it mattered so much, but she knew this human had already changed her in ways she couldn't explain. Later that day, when Elias stood again to continue his training, Sarath joined him. He looked at her in surprise. "You train now?" he asked, teasing. "I learn," she replied. "Perhaps some of your madness will teach me courage." Elias laughed softly, and the sound echoed through the room, the first laughter she had ever heard since he woke. It was strange, Sarath thought. This man had lost everything, his ship, his people, his world. And yet, he was the one teaching her how to live. As the two trained side by side, Sarath realized something deeper. It wasn't just about the strength of humans. It was about the heart they carried, fragile, scarred, but unbreakable. And as she watched Elias push through the pain once more, she whispered under her breath, "Perhaps that's why the stars still shine for your kind." He didn't hear her, but she meant every word. The alarm started in the middle of the night. A deep echoing sound shook the quiet halls of the Vorin space station, followed by a voice from the intercom shouting, "Breach in Sector 12. All personnel report to defense stations." Lieutenant Sarath jumped to her feet, heart pounding. She grabbed her weapon and ran through the glowing corridors, her steps echoing. Red emergency lights flashed on the metallic walls, painting everything in a shade of danger. When she turned a corner, she saw Elias Carter, already awake, already armed. He wore a half-fastened medical suit, his bandages still fresh, but his eyes were burning with determination. "You should be in recovery," Sarath shouted over the noise. He checked the charge on a pulse rifle he must have taken from the armory. "And you should be thanking me later," he replied. "Where are they coming from?" "Pirates," she said. "Scavengers from the outer rings. They're after the station's power core." Elias's jaw tightened. "Then we stopped them." Sarath stared at him. "You can barely stand." "I've stood through worse," he said, then gave her a small grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Come on, Lieutenant. I didn't survive a crash just to die lying down." And with that he ran toward the battle. The fight had already reached the main corridor. Dozens of pirates, ragged aliens with mismatched armor, were forcing their way in. The station's security drones fired, but they were outnumbered. Smoke filled the air and sparks rained from the ceiling. Sarath took cover behind a console, firing her plasma weapon. She saw Elias move through the chaos like he'd done it 100 times before. His movements weren't perfect. He was still hurt. But he fought with a kind of desperate purpose that no training could teach. When one of the pirates aimed at Sarath from behind, Elias was already there. He tackled the attacker, slamming his rifle into its chest. The alien fell, but Elias didn't stop. He grabbed a nearby energy shield and threw it toward her. "Keep going," he shouted. "They're heading for the reactor wing." Sarath wanted to tell him to fall back, to rest, to stop fighting like a man who had nothing left to lose. But the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't madness. It was meaning. Together they moved toward the reactor. The corridors were filled with smoke and fire. The air smelled of burning metal and ozone. When they reached the reactor room, Sarath froze. There were more pirates than they could handle, and one of them had placed an unstable plasma charge on the main coolant vent. If it detonated, the entire station would tear apart. Sarath turned to Elias. "We need to disarm it." He shook his head. "There's no time." "Get your people out. What about you?" she asked, panic rising in her voice. He looked at her and smiled sadly. "Someone has to stay and make sure it doesn't blow early." "No," she said, grabbing his arm. "You won't survive it. Neither will anyone else if I don't." For a moment their eyes met. Hers full of fear, his full of quiet resolve. Then without another word he pulled free and ran into the smoke. "Elias," she shouted, but he was already gone. Through the crackling comms she heard his voice. "Sarath, tell them to seal the bulkheads. I'll hold it here." She wanted to argue, but she heard the sound of gunfire and explosions. Her throat tightened. "You won't make it," she whispered. There was a pause. Then his soft voice came through, calm and steady. "I know, but they will. And that's enough." Seconds later, the reactor room erupted in a blinding flash. The shockwave threw Sarath to the ground. The sound roared through the station like thunder. Then, silence. When the smoke cleared, the pirate ships were gone. The reactor was intact. The station had survived, but Elias Carter was nowhere to be found. Sarath ran through the ruined corridors, shouting his name, searching every shadow, every broken panel. Finally, in the middle of the wreckage, she found his pulse rifle, burned but intact. She fell to her knees and picked it up, her eyes filling with tears she didn't know her kind could shed. He had done it. He had saved them all. One human, one wounded, fragile being, had stood against death and won. Sarath whispered into the silence. "You said you owed them everything. But you didn't just pay that debt, Elias. You gave everything." The stars outside flickered through the smoke as if bowing their heads in silence, and in that moment, Sarath finally understood what true courage looked like. Not the courage to kill, or to fight, but the courage to sacrifice. The battle was over, but the silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. The Voron station floated in the dark, scarred and smoking, but alive. Hundreds of lives had been saved, all because one human refused to stop fighting. Lieutenant Sarath stood in the wreckage of the main corridor, her uniform torn and her face streaked with ash. Around her, medical drones moved quickly, tending to the wounded. The air smelled of burnt metal and plasma. But Sarath heard only one sound, the echo of Elias Carter's last words in her mind. "Someone has to stay and make sure it doesn't blow early." She had ordered the bulkhead sealed. She had followed his instructions even when it broke her heart, and when the explosion came, she had believed it was the end. No one could survive a reactor blast like that, but still, she searched. For hours, she walked through the smoking halls, pushing away debris with her bare hands. She ignored her injuries, ignored the warnings of her commanders, ignored everything but the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't gone. She reached the reactor chamber at last. The walls were blackened, the air thick with smoke. The temperature sensors were dead and the lights flickered weakly, and then, she saw it. A hand. Small. Burned, but moving. Sarath ran forward, calling for medics. Together, they pulled away the fallen beams and broken panels until finally, through the dust and heat, Elias Carter appeared, unconscious, barely breathing, his uniform torn to shreds, but still alive. Sarath dropped to her knees beside him. her claws trembling as she touched his chest. His heart, that strange, powerful human heart, still beat. "He's alive," she whispered. "He's alive." The medics lifted him carefully and rushed him to the medical wing. Sarath followed close behind, refusing to leave his side. She watched as they worked on him, sealing burns, restoring oxygen, stabilizing his heart. For a long time she said nothing, afraid that if she spoke she might break the fragile miracle that had just happened. Hours later, when the room finally grew quiet, Sarath sat beside his bed. His breathing was weak, his skin pale, but his chest rose and fell. "That was enough. You saved us all," she said softly. "You saved people you didn't even know." Her voice trembled. She had seen soldiers sacrifice before, but not like this. Not someone who fought through pain, through fear, through death itself, just to give others a chance. When Elias opened his eyes again, it was almost morning. The first light from the nearby sun shone through the observation glass, turning the room gold. He blinked slowly, confused, then turned his head toward her. "You," he said in a weak voice, trying to smile. "You're still here." Sarath let out a shaky breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Of course. Someone had to make sure you didn't die after saving the galaxy." He laughed softly, though it hurt. "Didn't save the galaxy. Just a few people." "That's enough," she said. "That's more than enough." He tried to sit up, but she stopped him gently. "You need rest." He nodded, closing his eyes for a moment. Then he whispered, "You made it, right? Everyone safe?" "Yes," Sarath said quietly. "Because of you." He smiled faintly. "Good. Then I can finally rest." For a moment, Sarath thought he meant forever, and her heart froze. But then he added softly, "Just for a little while." She felt something deep in her chest, something warm, something she had never felt before. The Vorin didn't form bonds like this. They were trained to detach, to protect logic over emotion. But as she watched this broken, brave creature rest, she realized she had learned something precious. Humans didn't just fight battles. They inspired hearts. Later, as she stood outside the chamber watching him sleep, other officers gathered behind her. Some bowed their heads in silence. Others placed a hand on the glass. None spoke. They all knew the truth. One man, one human, had done what no fleet could have done. Sarath placed her hand on the window. "You said you owed them everything," she whispered. "But Elias Carter, how the stars owe you." Outside, the damaged station began to shine again as power returned. The emergency lights flickered back to white. Life moved forward, but Sarath knew things would never be the same. The Vorin Alliance had been saved not by their advanced technology, nor by their perfect logic, but by something simple and human. Courage born of love. And though Elias slept deeply, his story had already begun to move through the station, whispered from one survivor to another, until it became something larger than life, a legend, a reminder that even when the universe burned, humanity's light refused to go out. Days passed, and Elias Carter's story spread through the entire station like light breaking through clouds. Everyone spoke his name. The human who fought alone, who saved hundreds, who refused to die. The engineers rebuilt the damaged decks. The wounded recovered. But something deeper had changed. Something no one could repair or explain. The people had changed. Before Elias came, the Vorin soldiers were calm, cold, and disciplined. They followed rules, not hearts. They obeyed orders without question. But after the battle, they started wearing small metal badges on their uniforms, pieces of scrap from the wreck of the Dauntless. They said it reminded them to remember. Sarath smiled every time she saw it. The human's courage had done what no commander ever could. It had taught her people to feel again. Elias spent his days slowly recovering in the medical wing. His wounds healed, but his spirit never rested. He walked the halls talking with anyone who would listen. Engineers, young recruits, even the cleaning drones. His words were always simple but carried a quiet strength. "You fight," he said once to a young officer, "not because you hate what's in front of you, but because you love what's behind you." The officer never forgot that line. None of them did. Sarath often joined him during his walks. At first she told herself it was for duty, to monitor the patient. But as the days turned into weeks, she realized it wasn't duty anymore. It was something else, something softer. One evening, they stood together in the observation deck, watching the stars shimmer across the black sky. The glass was so clear it felt like they were standing in the middle of the universe itself. "You should go home soon," Sarath said quietly. "The Earth fleet has sent a message. They're offering to bring you back." Elias didn't answer right away. His eyes were on the stars, distant and thoughtful. "Home," he repeated softly as if testing the word. "It's strange. I've always thought home was a place. But maybe it's the people you fight for." Sarath tilted her head. "And who do you fight for now?" He looked at her, smiling faintly. Your people." "The station."
"Anyone who needs help. You'd stay?"
she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "If you'll have me," he said. The words were simple, but they hit her like a heartbeat. She didn't know what to say, so she only nodded. "Then stay, Elias Carter. The stars could use more humans like you." He laughed softly. "There aren't many of us left who are this stubborn." But she knew the truth. It wasn't stubbornness. It was love. Not romantic, not selfish, but love for life itself, for others, for what was right. Over time, Elias began to teach the younger soldiers how to fight like humans, not just with strength, but with heart. He told them that courage wasn't about not being afraid, but about standing even when fear tried to pull you down. Sarath watched them listen, wide-eyed and inspired. She had commanded soldiers for years, yet she had never seen anyone command souls like he did. One night, Sarath entered his room and found him sitting quietly, repairing a small object. It was his old ship insignia, the one he had carried since the day she first saw him asleep. He looked up and smiled. "It's almost whole again," he said. "It was broken," she replied. He nodded. "Yeah, but broken things can still be fixed." She realized he wasn't just talking about the badge, he was talking about himself. About her. About everyone on this station who had lost something. The next morning, Sarath called a meeting with the station command. She proposed a new symbol for their fleet, a mix of the Voran crest and the human insignia of the Dauntless. "It will remind us of what we learned here," she said. "That survival is not enough. We must remember, and we must protect." The council agreed, and just like that, the emblem of a fallen human ship became the mark of hope for an entire alliance. Later that day, as Elias stood beside her during the ceremony, Sarath felt something she had never felt before: pride, not in victory but in understanding. She glanced at him and said, "You've changed us, Elias, all of us." He smiled. "Maybe I just reminded you who you already were." Sarath looked out at the stars, their lights reflecting in her eyes. She had once thought humans were reckless, emotional creatures, too fragile for the vastness of space. Now she knew the truth. Humans weren't fragile. They were fire. Small, yes, but burning bright enough to light the darkness for everyone around them. And that fire had changed everything. Years passed, but the memory of Elias Carter never faded. The Voran Alliance rebuilt the station stronger than before, but the most lasting change wasn't in the walls, the technology, or the defenses. It was in the hearts of the people who lived there. Sarath often walked through the hallways, seeing recruits wear small badges, the broken insignia of the Dauntless fused into their uniforms. She remembered the first time she saw them, and how that small symbol, carried by a human who had survived impossible odds, had inspired an entire fleet. She still remembered the night he first opened his eyes, the pain in his body, the fire in his spirit. She had doubted he would survive, yet he had. Not just surviving, but transforming everyone around him. Elias never returned to Earth. He chose to stay among the stars, helping wherever he could. Colonies in the neutral zone remembered his name. Entire fleets spoke of the human who refused to die, who fought through pain not for glory but for others. Sarath watched over one such ceremony in the station's central hall. A new statue had been erected, a human figure tall and proud holding the Dauntless insignia close to his chest. The plaque beneath it read, "Elias Carter, the human who remembered." Children, young recruits, and veterans alike stood in silence, their eyes reflecting the bronze figure. Some bowed their heads. Some reached out to touch the base as if to draw courage from the metal itself. Sarath stood in the back watching. She could almost see him there, smiling faintly, watching the hearts he had changed. She remembered how he once told her softly, "Broken things can still be fixed." And he had fixed so much more than metal or machines. The stories grew with each telling. How he had walked into fire without fear. How he had carried hope when no one else could. How his memory had inspired the Varan to act not just with duty but with heart. Sometimes, she swore she could feel him beside her in the quiet moments, walking the observation deck looking out at the stars, and murmuring that simple truth she had never forgotten. You fight not because you hate what's in front of you, but because you love what's behind you. Even the stars seemed to remember him. Every time she gazed out at the endless black, she thought she saw a faint glimmer, a spark that reminded her of his courage, his heart, his human spirit. Sarath often found herself smiling when she thought of him, not because he was gone, but because he had left something greater than himself, a legacy that would outlive any fleet, any station, any battle. And it wasn't just the Varan who remembered. Traders in the neutral zone spoke of the human who refused to give up. Scientists in distant colonies told their students about him. Pilots recounted the story before every dangerous mission. A human who had walked into death, carrying only hope and memory, and had survived. Elias Carter had become more than a man. He had become an idea, a spark, a reminder that even the smallest, weakest, most broken among us could light the darkness. Sarath leaned against the observation glass one evening, the stars stretching endlessly before her. She whispered to herself, almost in prayer, "You never stopped fighting, did you?" Somewhere out there she believed he heard her, and she believed he smiled. Because humanity, she finally understood, wasn't defined by technology, strength, or numbers. It was defined by the courage to carry hope, to protect others, and to remember those who could no longer fight. Elias Carter had done all of that. And more. In that moment, Sarath knew the truth that would guide the Alliance for generations. The stars belonged not only to those who survived, but to those who dared to care, and the human had dared more than anyone could imagine. The legacy of Elias Carter, the human who refused to surrender to pain, who held on to memory, hope, and love, would shine in the galaxy forever. Even in the darkest void, his light would never fade.